Wow, I just want to start off being grateful for this space and everybody coming out on a Sunday, I guess. Never got to see a Gary Weber talk live, so that was really exciting. A little bit of context. I've been teaching at Penn State for about 20 years, and I was doing some research on psychedelics from a purely scholarly point of view. Insert laughter. No, it's true. It's like, actually, no. I got invited to Berkeley once it ceased to be scholarly. Yes. No, I really was. I like to get interested. One of the things I think I have in common with Gary is that I get captivated by these very simple questions. And I wanted to know the answer to the question of how people had studied psychedelics scientifically. Because I'd experienced them, and I thought, well, how are you going to squeeze this into a journal article exactly, right? And when I found out that Timothy Leary at Harvard had collaborated with his friend William S. Burroughs, a writer, to use the cut-up technique on the write-up of reports that people were giving after taking psilocybin or LSD, I thought, oh, this is beautiful, because this is the union between literature and science, two of my loves. So I wanted to study that, but I knew that in order to really properly study it, I wasn't going to just study it from the outside. There was something sort of horrible and wrong about that, that just didn't seem like it was being even remotely authentic. Because I knew that William Burroughs, one of the writers who I sometimes teach courses on at Penn State, had gone down to South America in search of what he called yahe, or the final fix. He had heard actually that yahe or ayahuasca, which is both or a mixture of multiple plants, was a way of treating long-term addiction, which he suffered from. It now turns out, fast forward, that is a very promising avenue of research. So Burroughs was indeed on the right path. But I wondered how exactly I was going to get funded to do this research, to go down to South America, because I knew that Penn State wasn't going to fund it, and I knew that my pockets were relatively empty at the time. And through a series of coincidences, I got to go down to Peru and study with a remarkable woman named Norma Pandoro. And the joke was really on me, because I thought I was the smartest person in the world going down there, getting paid to take drugs and talk about them on NPR. But the only thing that ended up on NPR was the sound of me vomiting, actually, because the audio producer couldn't believe what I was saying after the experiences that I had. So all that is on the cutting room floor, and it was a classic. A word I want to introduce to you. It was an experience of metanoia. It was an experience of transformation in my consciousness that I had no expectation of experiencing. And I had had some experience with psychedelics in the past, and I'd had, interesting and profound even experiences on psychedelics. But under no circumstances did I think that I was going down to Peru secular and that I was going to come back not secular. But that is in fact what occurred. And I went to Peru with lifelong severe asthma that I was in and out of the hospital with constantly, and came back healed. Now, that will, do something to you, right? That will shift your focus. And so I'm giving this context because then what ensued from about 2002 on was the attempt to sort of comprehend, and I can now say in retrospect, stabilize what had occurred under my instruction and work with Norma Pandoro. And it's that context in which I met Gary Weber some years ago, where after I'd had this opening and my brain was maybe, firing in that way that is represented in that new ayahuasca research, but I didn't have a context for it. And although I was a long-term meditator since '97 anyway, I didn't really have practices that were tuned towards kind of stabilizing and abiding in that state. And it was a chance meeting with Gary on the street in State College, Pennsylvania, when I was looking for somebody who could please help me learn some Sanskrit, that really this whole process that leads me to come here today unfolded. I'm the world's slowest Sanskrit student. Okay, so let's just put it that way. I love it, and what I love about it is the same thing I love about my study of language and rhetoric in general, is that it allows me to cultivate that space where I can abide in that stillness and watch as the words have their effects. And watch as the words that we're using constantly, not only in our internal self-monologue, but the words that we're using with each other and about ourselves on a daily basis are really programming us, for lack of a better term, in a way that is really quite predictable and extraordinarily, if I can use this word, toxic. And so what my teaching consists of now in the university and outside is really a focus on teaching people how to recognize the way in which they're mistaking the idea that they have of themselves, which is a linguistic phenomenon and very partial, and just a bunch of those Post-it notes that Gary was pointing to, a bunch of words that have stuck to your awareness. And I'm teaching people how to work with language so that they can experience the difference between the idea they have of themselves and then who they are, who they really are. And we would never make the mistake of thinking that the word a cow has anything to do with that wonderful creature standing out in a field in Pennsylvania right now, maybe providing some of the milk that's in that delicious tea in there. We might think that there's a kind of interesting conventional association between those words in English, but we wouldn't mistake one for the other. But experientially, I can tell you that I, for a very long time, mistook one for the other. The idea that I had of myself, which was linguistic and generated by that self-referential internal narrative, and what and who I am, were conflated. And once you start to see the distinction between those two things, once you start to allow language to just be language, just be labels that we're using in a conventional way to organize this world and space-time together, you start to feel how much larger and astronomical, galactic in magnitude that awareness is that's behind the language. So that's what I come and try to share with you today. Now, as I was going through that stabilization process and just trying to sort of come to terms with what had occurred, I explored and continue to explore all of the great wisdom traditions on the planet, hence my interest in Sanskrit. But the one that perhaps I was the most resistant to and wanted to keep a distance from absolutely was that one that is perhaps best represented by this now duct-taped copy of the King James Bible. I was raised with no religious upbringing whatsoever. I was raised in the 1970s in New Jersey, and by the time they got to me, I was the third of 3 children. I just said, no thank you. My only impression of church was that it smelled bad. Honestly, I'm just being honest, that's all I know how to do. And that I saw that shells on the beach where I grew up were beautiful, complex, and remarkable phenomena. And what did church have to teach me about that? It didn't offer me anything at all. So it was much, much to my surprise that the joke was so on me in Peru that I experienced this classic, straight out of Exodus, I am sequence that I then was left in my lap to deal with for the rest of my life. And it's been a glorious adventure exploring that. And as I gently began to explore it from the Sanskrit tradition side, I came across a book that many of you probably remember or have seen, a very thin little book just called The Sermon on the Mount According to Vedanta by Swami Prabhupada. And he reads the Sermon on the Mount in the book of Matthew from this perspective. And I read this book, and it was, I just kind of slapped myself in the forehead and say, okay, I can read this book now. And so that was about 10 or 15 years ago, and I really started reading. No, it was about 10 years ago, and I started reading it with some deliberation and regularity. And one of the things that occurs, as Gary says, out of the stillness, is that various sorts of synchronicities just sort of start happening. You start to be in the right place in the right time for something to occur. And it turned out that there was a great deal of pressure in my university for me to teach more students in larger classes. No problem. And I look on the book to see, well, what class could I offer that would attract more students than the introduction to science fiction, right? Because that one draws quite a few. Yes, exactly. It's quite a good class, you know. And I said, oh, look at this. Introduction to the Bible as literature. Oh, yeah, right. I like that, right? So I did my due diligence, and I did some scholarly research for a couple years to make sure I was like really in the position to begin the introductory teaching of this text. And I've done so, and as I've begun to do so, right, you know, the course is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, even though it sells out faster and faster and faster. And I think it's because they want big classes, but not on this. You know, because what is very interesting is, as you no doubt know, the reason why it sells out very quickly is that we're in this very interesting historical moment, right? That this text is still here a couple thousand, 2,500 years later. It's not old compared to a lot of other traditions, but it's this culturally intense document that I wanted to stay away from. That I wanted it to be, you know, if it was in the house, it had to be put, you know, somewhere else. And so we have this text sitting there. And even during the Bush years, I became convinced that the book of Revelations was a more important cultural document than the Constitution of the United States, so I better read it. And the experience of sitting down with students of different backgrounds and actually working through the Bible in a slow way so that the passages emerge out of the stillness and our response emerge out of the stillness has been quite remarkable. So it's that experience that I wanted to share with you today, because Gary has shown you the way in which the brain is trying to do this. And if the brain is trying to do this, if we're trying to achieve this zeroing out of the blah blah state, we would expect that the global wisdom traditions would have bumped up against this, right? I always like to ask the question of how many times was the bow and arrow invented, right? Every time, you know, somebody says, hey, look at the curve on that, I see meat, you know, with that. And I think the same thing is true about the experience of non-dual awareness, that we have come up with linguistic, musical, artistic, practical ways of inducing these states in all of the different global traditions, and that they're right in front of us and we're not recognizing them quite often. So I feel like if we can find this in the King James Bible, then we're going to start to see the ubiquity of the way in which non-dual awareness is actually peeking through all of these historical places where we think it is not to be found. So it's precisely because I thought it was not to be found here that I find it so powerful here. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of that from the Bible. The two key words I like to organize the course around these days are the words agape and metanoia, both being Greek terms, both of which are more or less untranslatable. And so we'll just kind of leave them as untranslatable, but we'll still talk about them as untranslatable, because that's what we do in non-dual awareness workshops, is have words that can't possibly refer to the thing that we're talking about. And the way I teach the course is I say, look, you know, we talk about the so-called New Testament, and we call it new because it's in contradistinction with the so-called Old Testament, which only becomes old when the new one shows up. So by that point, they're totally confused and they're ready, right? So I'm using Greek terms that are coming from the New Testament, but in fact, we can look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there is a continuity that both of these phenomena, agape and metanoia, are refrains. They're like the chorus of these teachings. And as the chorus of these teachings, they're both, which is slightly less important, the content of what is being transmitted, I would suggest to you, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Not the only content, but a major content that is being transmitted in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But also the practice that is being transmitted in the Old Testament and the New Testament. These are not primarily passages that are being offered as items of belief or disbelief. They are instead, remember I said that we're programming ourselves with this language. And remember Gary said sometimes that we need to upgrade our mental operating system. And in order to upgrade our mental operating system, one of the first things we have to do is defrag what's already there. And agape and metanoia are these kind of returning terms and states of awareness that return again and again in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Two places in the Old Testament where we can point to that this is operative and that we might not have seen, right? Which is that coming from, most of us anyway, coming from a Western point of view, so-called, we read the opening passages of Genesis, or we hear the opening passages of Genesis, and we sort of pass over. We don't even really hear those passages because they become so familiar, right? So, for example, we read a phrase like "in the beginning," and we think we know what it means. And because we think we know what the beginning of this talk was like, right? Like when I sat down and asked Joseph. But the kind of distinction between the beginning of this or that and the beginning of anything whatsoever that is being pointed to here is so enormous that it really breaks the ability of the language to really carry it, right? It's because we think we know what the beginning was. But in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was that without form and void. So again, the traditional way to read this would be to say, oh, yeah, phew. Elohim comes along and fills that void because otherwise I was going to have to shock myself. That void, I cannot handle that void because when I have that void, I don't know. I know I'm getting paid for this study, but I do not like the void, right? That's our association. But in fact, if we slow down a little bit and we say, this was the very, where the creativity comes from is the void. So, and we can connect this to agape as saying, well, why? Why do we want to get to this selfless state? Because if we get to this selfless state, everything comes into existence, right? And so then we can begin to meditate on Genesis and say, oh, it wasn't about then. In the beginning, we can watch our thoughts, as Gary was asking us to do, and say, look, they're coming out of the void. All of creation, all of creativity just comes out of the void. And this is very easy to see if we will do it. My daughter, Violet, who's 8 years old, she's going through, probably some of you are psychologists and probably know that there's probably a developmental phase where children go through and they no longer believe in magic. Or at least they find it important to say that they no longer believe in magic. Even though maybe less than 16 months earlier, she had had a conversation with a tree that was quite extensive, right? So she announces at the table one day, she says, Daddy, I don't believe in magic. And I said, oh yeah? Well, where do your thoughts come from? And she went, yeah. It's just like, if our definition of magic is that something comes out of nothing, then, this little meditation on Genesis flips it around from being like, oh, thank God, literally, that, the void has been filled, but instead that what God creates with, or that what the act of creation involves, is getting to the void. So this forms this continuity then. You see, we think that, that Jesus comes along in the New Testament and says, hey, this is the next word, metanoia. And this one, the King James translation, is a beautiful translation in many ways. It's like really imprinted the English language in lovely ways. Even slash especially the Rastafarians in Jamaica, they prefer the King James translation to the translation into their patois because of the cadences and forms. But in the King James translation, when John the Baptist is teaching and saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and when Jesus teaches, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, that word repent actually is the translation of metanoia, which I'll now hazard to give it means, dude, flip your head inside out. It doesn't mean I'm sorry. It means I have misconstrued. There's a figure ground reversal that takes place, whereas what I thought was real, namely the material world, is in fact only apparent reality, and what is real, namely the world of consciousness, is in fact reality. If we go through the Sermon on the Mount and look at what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. These are practices, these are repetitions, these are Pilates for your mind, to pull your mind inside out, to stop taking what you think is reality and see what is actually that from which the reality is bubbling up. If you look at the theological commentary, all kinds of gymnastics are done to try to avoid this one. But I'm going to offer you this one to see that it points to the necessity of affirming this non-dual interpretation as at least one of the layers that Jesus was offering. There's always this dynamic in this passage in chapter 5 where it's saying, and so you have heard it is this way. And he says, this is chapter 5, verse 33 of Matthew, and he says, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. In other words, you shouldn't break your promises, but you should keep your promises unto the Lord, right? And you have heard that. And this is his refrain. He keeps saying, you've heard it, this is so, but I'm going to tell you how it is as part of the reversal. And he says, but I say unto you, swear not at all. Amazing, right? Swear not at all. Neither by heaven, for it is God's throne. In other words, don't promise, don't summon the I thought. Keep it blue, exactly. Don't summon the red, for not by heaven, for it is God's throne. This shows you how systematic it is. Not by the earth, for it is footstool. Not by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because you can say, okay, well, by me, by my word. Because you can't make a single one of your hairs white or black. It's saying, have no eye. And the fact that this tradition, which has become, in my experience, growing up in this country, mobilized by, judge so that you are not judged rather than judge not, lest ye be judged, is so powerful to experience the difference between what this says and what the institutions that have transmitted this, for the most part, say that it says. It's itself generative of a metanoia. And so I hope to bring that to you today, and I appreciate your patience.